The gist of it, for anyone who's not familiar, is that basically the House and the Senate will be reviewing three crypto bills: the Clarity Act, which is the market structure bill, the Genius Act, which is the stablecoin bill, and then there's an anti-CBDC bill. So we'll kind of jump through each one. But before we do that, David, I want to go to you to kind of get a lay of the land here. I know you sort of have a good pulse check on the landscape in DC, the dynamics that are at play. So I'm kind of curious, like how we even got a crypto week in the first place, and what that maybe means specifically for Bitcoin, because I think that might be kind of getting lost in DC this week.
Yeah. I mean, that's also one of those things where, it depends on where you want to start the story, I guess. But I guess the most logical place to start would be in the election spending in the 2024 election. The crypto industry writ large kind of did something unprecedented in American politics, at least to my knowledge. They went from being a relatively minor player to being the largest corporate player in politics in America by a Texas mile. Like, I remember reading this statistic that I think it was like 1/3 of all super PAC donations from corporations and PAC donations from corporations were from crypto companies. So they kind of just hit the scene with an insane level of spending. And then I think a lot of what we're seeing is really just downstream of that, right? When you come into American politics and you spend more money than any industry, it's not shocking that you're going to start seeing things like Crypto Week in DC. I mean, crypto policy itself has gone from being kind of this niche thing that, a handful of people were paying attention to kind of like the hot thing in DC and sort of an issue du jour. I mean, there are like 9, I think, crypto policy groups in DC. We recently saw things like the Solana Policy Institute, great name choice by them. So yeah, I think a lot of this is like election spending, really downstream of that, at least in terms of elevating the issue. The other big thing and the other big dynamic is that you have a lot of senior leaders who are just genuinely interested in Bitcoin, right? Like JD Vance has disclosed, for a while now that he owns, a modest amount of Bitcoin. RFK has his entire net worth apparently denominated in Bitcoin. So a lot of the presidents in our circle are, ideological and financial supporters of the industry. But I think the interesting, sort of thing to watch, and I guess why this is all coming to a head now, is I think it's clear that if you spend, $150 million in an election cycle, you can get your issues elevated and discussed. I think the question is, whether that and favorable political conditions are sufficient to actually turn that attention into policy. Frankly, I think the sort of beltway view from people outside of the crypto policy world has kind of been that the crypto people are rich but dumb. And, that the incentive for politicians is to smile, to take photos, to post bullish things on Truth Social or X, and then do very little in substance. Because that's really the game of the sort of policy industrial complex in the United States. Like, you don't actually want to be pay for play if you are a large super PAC or a large advocacy organization. Your incentive at that point is to kind of keep the donors coming back. So you come in and you spend $150 million in an election. And for a lot of actors, the rational incentive is to work really hard on getting your pet issues done and get right up to the finish line. But geez, we couldn't get it done. We need your help in the midterms. Then we'll get it done. Geez, we couldn't get it done in the midterms. We really, really need your help in 2028. And then we'll be able to do all of the things that you want. I think the crypto week and the 3 bills are kind of the point at which that thesis will be validated or invalidated. Most of the money that was spent in DC with respect to crypto was not Bitcoin specific, but was the large exchanges, financial services companies, stablecoins. So, there's a reason that we've seen such a strong focus on market structure and stablecoins respectively. It'll be interesting to see like what comes of this, but it's, I think most of this can be attributed to those two things, the massive amount of spending and the fact that you have a lot of senior leaders who are, sort of supporters. Whether those two things are enough and a Republican trifecta are sufficient to kind of codify long-standing desires from the crypto industry into law, I think, remains to be seen, but will be answered in relatively short order.
Quick follow up, and then we'll go to Zach here to dig into the substance a little more. Is to what extent, obviously Bitcoin and Bitcoin companies, Bitcoin supporters had not put as much money towards these particular interests as, the crypto industry writ large has. But to what extent can Bitcoin sort of like tag along on some of these proposals? Like I think, the BRCA is a good example of that. But I'm just curious, like to what extent, and this is largely kind of, a strategy we use at BPI is, like to what extent can Bitcoin sort of find its way into those larger proposals that have sort of the money behind it?
Well, because if you're not talking about stablecoins like exclusively, it's pretty much impossible to have a conversation about crypto and not talk about Bitcoin, right? It is one of my favorite sort of dynamics to see play out, where I think the sort of the fact that Bitcoin is like 60% of the crypto market and is like maybe 1/10 of that in terms of political spending is like extremely strong empirical evidence of the thing that actually makes Bitcoin different, which is that it's decentralized, right? There's not like a Bitcoin, there aren't many Bitcoin companies, right? There's no Bitcoin CEO. There's no Bitcoin foundation that can print new Bitcoins to go spend like Ripple can. So I think the fact that Bitcoin is so underweight in DC spending with respect to its market cap relative to its market cap is just like excellent evidence that Bitcoin is different. And I think that even if you are not a crypto native person, but you're a DC political person, it's hard. You sort of see that. You're like, I'm taking all of these meetings with the heads of these token foundations or these exchanges, but I look at the data that my staffer prepared for me, and it looks like most of this market is Bitcoin. So I think at a very high level, any sort of spending that's done to elevate crypto kind of necessarily drags Bitcoin along with it. And because Bitcoin is the largest cryptocurrency, sort of the foundational reserve asset within the cryptocurrency world, it benefits a lot indirectly from that. But I also think the nature of the spending, like who's actually paying the money, who's sending the dollars, sort of mimetically and empirically validates something that, a sort of core thesis that BPI was built on, which is that it's tough to talk about crypto as a whole when you're talking about regulation because crypto is so diverse. And most of these tokens are, basically securities or maybe not securities, but they're essentially corporate entities on a blockchain. At least they operate like that in practice, right? There's like a small group of people that can make decisions about spending large pools of capital. Bitcoin has none of those trappings. So yeah, I think it's definitely reinforcing a core truth, which is that Bitcoin is just fundamentally distinct from the rest of crypto.